Good morning, everyone. I'm Blaise Mishtal, JINSA's Vice President for Policy. We'll be talking today about where things stand in the negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. To have that conversation with us, I'm delighted to be joined by Elliot Abrams, a member of JINSA's Iran Policy Project and former U.S. Special Representative for Iran. JINSA Senior Advisor Steve Rademacher, also former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation, and my good colleague here at JINSA, our Director of Foreign Policy, Jonathan Rui. The reason we're having this conversation today is that back in March, when President Trump sent a letter to Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei suggesting negotiations over Iran's nuclear program, that letter reportedly included a 2-month deadline. I think we were all heartened to hear that because as JINSA's Iran Policy Project, that everyone here is a member of, wrote in a report in January saying that the Iran nuclear program is a day one priority and challenge for the administration, and laying out a strategy for how to deal with it. Having time-limited negotiations was an important part of that strategy because we've seen so often that Iran just drags on talks and uses them to its advantage. And so that 2-month deadline was a really interesting part of President Trump's proposal. It's never been clear when exactly the clock started ticking on that deadline or when it would run out. But one reasonable interpretation is that the clock started at the start of negotiations. Now, the first round of negotiations between Iran and the United States happened on April 11th, and we are now exactly 2 months past that date on June 11th. And so I guess my first question to you, Elliot, is has time run out for negotiations with Iran? Has this 2-month deadline expired? Do we see any evidence that President Trump is sticking to his guns on this one?
Thank you for the question. The 2-month deadline has gone down the memory hole. You will notice that the president never mentions it. And in fact, talks are supposed to take place, I guess, in Oman on Sunday. So I think there's a general sense that if Witkoff and the president conclude that the Iranians are really playing with them and have no intention ever of reaching a deal, then the negotiations would come to an end. But I think the idea that the president is going to set a deadline and keep it has really gone by the wayside.
Do we have a sense of why that is? Was it never a serious proposal in the first place, or is it optimism in negotiations, or why has this gone by the wayside?
Oddly enough, I'd say it's pretty well summed up in an article in the New York Times today by David Sanger. That is, if you end the negotiations, if you say, okay, the Iranians are never going to reach an acceptable deal acceptable to the United States, then there are consequences. And the consequences logically are that force is going to be used to stop their nuclear weapons program. It's more likely that the administration will do, I think, that the administration will do, in a sense, what the Obama administration did, and that is look for compromise. In the case of Obama, it was the JCPOA. If the leaked versions of the Witkoff proposal are correct, then what Witkoff is looking for is a compromise in which the Iranians are allowed to enrich to a low level in Iran temporarily, while they, and the so-called international community, IAEA, establish a kind of consortium to enrich uranium someplace in the Middle East. There are two problems with that. The first is that it does allow Iran to continue enriching uranium, which means it maintains its infrastructure to do that. And second, I don't know if anyone on this webcast will be alive by the time they get to that consortium. I mean, there's there's no incentive for the Iranians to agree to anything, and it's complicated. And so I think it's not just that Trump's term will end, but it allows the Iranians to enrich indefinitely. And then Trump leaves in January 2029, and who knows what the next president will do about it.
Steve, let me ask you about this consortium idea that, as Elliot said, is reportedly contained in the U.S. proposal. Is this a new idea? Have we heard of this before?
Well, I mean, this variations of this idea have been around for a long time, and it's not a crazy idea. As sort of a compromise outcome, because Iran's argument, their claim is that the only reason they're enriching uranium is because they need fuel for their nuclear program, and they don't want to be dependent on third countries. So they need an indigenous capability. Now, the United States is dependent on uranium from enriched uranium from third countries, and we manage, but that's their argument. The my biggest fear with the idea is I think the Iranians can buy into it very quickly, and they of course will volunteer to provide the enrichment facility at Natanz, and say, well, we're happy to enrich uranium for all the countries of the region, UAE, Saudi Arabia, anybody else who wants it. To my mind, this could, if mishandled, this actually becomes a way for Iran to attract international investment into their nuclear enrichment program. That would be a completely unacceptable outcome. Where I think the rubber hits the road on the whole idea is, what's the location of the facility? If it's somewhere outside of Iran, and there are sufficient safeguards in place, and basically Iran is an investor, and maybe they've contributed some of their technology to it, technology that they already have, that would be a face-saving way to make sure that this enrichment capability can never be used to produce highly enriched uranium for an Iranian nuclear weapons program. But if the facility is on Iranian territory, then absolutely at any moment it could be converted into, the Iranians will have control of it. And if they choose, they could kick out inspectors, they could kick out the other partners, and very quickly proceed to produce highly enriched uranium for nuclear weapons. So the critical question is going to be, what is the location of it? And lots of academic papers have been written on this idea, but usually they leave undefined the location. And I do think if this idea makes any further progress, there needs to be attention to the question of what is the location. The decision needs to be made, and the decision has to be that the location will be somewhere other than Iran, which I think will be a non-starter with the Iranians, because at the end of the day, they actually are not so much worried about nuclear fuel as the ability to threaten the rest of the world with a nuclear weapons program, which they will only have if they have an enrichment facility on their territory.
So, Jonathan, to Steve's point, have we heard any rumors or any indications of where the location of this consortium might be? And do we know what Iran's reaction to the Witkoff proposal was?
So, yeah, I think there's been no shortage of rumors, at least. Iran will insist that if there is something that what the U.S. is currently calling a consortium, it would be on Iranian soil, because it would go to Iran's core, basically red line, that we heard Supreme Leader Khamenei reiterate last week, that Iran will continue enrichment on its own soil, and certainly that's been reflected in the position of its negotiators. We've heard proposals for putting it on various islands in the Persian Gulf, and then sort of that raises a whole new Pandora's box of issues about who controls those islands, and things to that effect. So I think a lot of that's still to be determined. From what we've heard, the Iranians have said they're going to reject or refuse Witkoff's proposal, the one that contained the consortium, but that should not be taken as a no in terms of ending negotiations. Iran is very, very good at neither saying yes nor no. To Elliot's earlier point, that we'll all be dead by the time people would admit talks fail. Iran is very good at sort of finding ways to drag out the talks. Trump has started to publicly articulate his own sense of that. in response to Khamenei's response last week. So I think we'll see what Iran has to say. But my guess, if past practice is any indication, is that it will be an invitation for even more prolonged, open-ended, and perhaps indeterminate talks.
If I could just jump in,
Yeah.
President Trump has said within the last couple of days, they can't enrich, they can't enrich. So I guess the way out for the administration is to say we've reached an interim arrangement. And the Iranians can say, okay, in this deal, we're enriching in Iran. And the Trump administration can say temporary, and the deal calls for the end of enrichment in Iran at some point. I don't know if that's acceptable to the Iranians, because the Trump administration wants to be able to say that enrichment won't be in Iran. And the Iranians keep repeating there will be enrichment in Iran. So if there is this kind of interim deal, it's going to be, what lawyers would say about it is there was no meeting of the minds. One side's going to say, no, in the end, no enrichment in Iran. The other is going to say, no, we agreed there would be. So it's a phony deal if that's the kind of deal that is made.
Reminds me a little bit of the parsing of whether the negotiations were direct negotiations or indirect negotiations when all of this kicked off 2 months ago.
Yeah.
Because even though the U.S. and the Iranians were in different rooms, they met in the hallway, and so you could interpret that either way. But to press a little further on that point, Elliot, as you brought up, earlier in this whole negotiations process, there seemed to be disagreement within the administration about what the U.S. position on Iranian enrichment was, and you had some people in the administration saying total dismantlement, no enrichment. You had Witkoff saying verification, which seemed to suggest that enrichment was okay as long as there was some sort of monitoring process put in place. Since then, we seem to have seen the administration take a harder, more cohesive line on no enrichment. And then we get this proposal. So, to push you a little further, does that mean the administration is actually backing away from the no enrichment line? Do you think they're going to end up compromising on that? That'll go down the memory hole, as you said, the 2-month deadline did? Or do you think they'll hold firm on this?
I'm very clear that no one has any understanding of what this administration's policy is. You just stated the reasons. We also know of influences on the administration. For example, Senator Lindsey Graham is apparently about to introduce a resolution that calls for total dismantlement of the Iranian program, and he's an intimate of the president's. You have, the other side, the sort of Tucker Carlson side, that thinks that any criticism of doing a compromise deal with Iran is just coming from the warmongers. The president's rhetoric, if you take it straightforwardly, it looks like pretty hardline rhetoric. I think it was yesterday also that he said the Iranians are being uncooperative and being tough, much tougher than they should be. But where is it all going? Maybe the president and Witkoff have a very clear endpoint in their minds. But I think, judging by what's on the public record, it is impossible to say what exactly the policy is.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Blaise, I have two thoughts on this point. The first is, I tend to take the Iranians at their word that, their bottom line is that, they want to be able, they need to be able to continue enriching on their soil. And if the U.S. position is as absolute as sometimes has been conveyed by the Trump administration, then there's really nothing to talk about. Yet we'll notice that the two sides are about to enter the 6th round of talks. So clearly the discussions are continuing. The Iranians, taking them at their word about their position, they must have some reason to think that the Trump administration is less inflexible than some of the comments made by administration officials have suggested. And of course, we've seen some comments by administration officials that do appear more open to the idea of enrichment in Iran. So I worry that, conflicting signals perhaps are being sent or at least received, and that's one of the reasons that the negotiations are continuing. The other important consideration, though, is, we talked about the president's deadline of evidently June 11th. Let's be clear, that was an artificial deadline. I mean, there was no magic. I mean, that was just the president said 2 months. Why not 3 months? Why? It was completely arbitrary and therefore flexible. And I think we're seeing how flexible it is, because I don't think anything is going to happen tomorrow. There's another deadline, though, that is real, and that is October 18th of this year. And that is the date on which UN Security Council Resolution 2231 expires. And with the expiration of that Security Council resolution will also expire the legal availability of what's called Snapback of UN sanctions on Iran. Now, prior to the JCPOA, there was a whole raft of UN Security Council imposed sanctions on Iran. And the beauty of UN Security Council imposed sanctions is they are obligatory. In other words, every country in the world is required as a matter of international law to comply with UN Security Council imposed sanctions. I mean, the United States, since Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, the United States has imposed a whole series of sanctions on Iran, but these are unilateral US sanctions. Other countries, many countries object, actually. They complain about the US sanctions. They certainly are not under any legal requirement to impose their own sanctions or even comply with the American sanctions. So under Resolution 2231, which was adopted when the JCPOA came into force, all of the UN Security Council resolution, all of the UN Security Council imposed sanctions were suspended. They weren't terminated, they were suspended. And there's a mechanism available under 2231 to bring them all back into force. And that mechanism is available until October 18th, at which point that mechanism essentially evaporates with the rest of the resolution. And what this means is the Iranians have a very strong incentive to run out the clock. And, I worry that that's precisely what they're doing here, keeping negotiations going, even though they have no intention whatsoever of agreeing to anything. Look, if they wanted a nuclear deal with the United States, the Biden administration was desperate to give them one. And the Iranians came up with excuse after excuse to avoid entering a new JCPOA or a revived JCPOA with the Biden administration. I'm not sure what has changed in Iran that would make them suddenly interested in a nuclear deal with the United States. Maybe, post October 7th, their thinking has changed. I don't know. But what I do know is that no matter where they want to end up with a deal, they would definitely like to get past October 18th without a snapback of the UN Security Council sanctions that were in effect prior to 2015. Because in today's world, with de facto alliance between Russia and Iran, and frankly, China and Iran as well, there's no chance that new UN Security Council sanctions will be imposed on Iran. The only way to get UN sanctions on Iran is to bring the old ones back into force, which happens automatically if any one of the 3 European countries that signed on to the JCPOA trigger the mechanism. If all they have to do is trigger the mechanism, and the snapback is essentially automatic. But if you're Iran, you'd like to prevent that, and the way you prevent that potentially is by negotiating and seemingly in good faith. Just as Trump has told the Israelis, please don't attack Iran while we're negotiating, one has to wonder whether the message is being sent to the Europeans, please don't trigger a snapback right now because it will upset our negotiations. That is precisely the message the Iranians would like the Trump administration to send to the Europeans.
Yeah, and if anyone in our audience wants to better understand the snapback mechanism, the UN sanctions that would go back in place if it's triggered, I'd commend to you an excellent paper by JINSA fellow Gabe Naronha, who lays everything out, which you can find at our website, jinsa.org. But Steve, let me follow up and ask you, um, given the importance of this October 18th deadline, the power of the snapback mechanism, do we know if this is something that the Trump administration is working toward? Is it coordinating with, as you said, the European countries that would be the ones that would have to trigger this?
I don't know. I do know the issue is very much on the mind of the Europeans. It was also on the mind of the Trump administration. If you look at the president's policy directive that he issued shortly after taking office, this was his directive that mandated the reinstitution of the maximum pressure policy on Iran. One of the elements explicitly stated in that presidential memorandum was that America's diplomats were to work with the 3 European countries that have the ability to trigger a snapback to encourage them to do precisely that. So that's in black and white. That is in a signed memorandum from President Trump. But that memo was issued before Ambassador Witkoff began his negotiations, and I don't know if in the real world the guidance spelled out in the president's policy directive is actually being implemented. It's quite conceivable to me that today actually what's being conveyed on on the ground is, please don't trigger a snapback while we're negotiating, because we think that would blow up the negotiations. And one hopes that the Europeans respond, well, okay, we'll give you some time, but we're not going to allow October 18th to be reached without triggering this snapback, because it's a tool that we have today and that we will not have after October 18th. So it's a use it or lose it situation. And if you haven't gotten a deal, we need to use it. One hopes that's their position.
It's worth adding that in this period of negotiation, last several months, the Iranians have not frozen their program. As a matter of fact, they're moving forward in the enrichment of uranium at high levels, at 60% levels. We have the IAEA's most recent reports on this at the very end of May, doubling the amount of 60% enriched uranium, whose only purpose, as the IAEA continually reminds us, whose only purpose is for nuclear weapons. They have no other purpose. And no other country has ever enriched, no country has ever enriched to 60% without going on to build a nuclear weapon. So it isn't as if, the Israelis are not attacking, the Iranians are not invoking snapback, and the Iranians have frozen their program. No, the Iranians have doubled the speed of their program.
Well, that seems like a very good entree to ask Jonathan if you could maybe actually give us an update on the status of Iran's nuclear program. What did we learn from the latest IAEA report? How far along are the Iranians?
Yeah, thank you, Blaze. Nolan, if you could switch to the slideshow. We've got just a couple slides here. For our audience, this is sort of a sneak preview of a brief that JINSA will be putting out in the coming days that breaks down the nitty-gritty of the IAEA report, the data of which is, as of this morning, available on the IAEA's website. So if there's sort of one snapshot to take away from this most recent report, which covers Iran's activities from February to May of this year, it's this chart right here. Everyone likes to talk about breakout time, which is the amount of time Iran would need to produce its first bomb's worth of 90% high enriched uranium. That breakout time has been merely a matter of days for months, if not years now. So that's not news. That's sadly unchanged. But breakout capacity, this chart here, gives you a more sort of three-dimensional view of Iran's expansion. As Elliot mentioned, they've doubled their enrichment of 60% uranium, which represents about 95 to 99% of the time and effort they need to produce weapons-grade uranium, which is 90%, which can fit in a warhead. But breakout capacity here, this measures Iran's ability not really to produce that first bomb's worth, but to keep producing bomb after bomb's worth on a sustained basis month after month. And basically, you'll see here the one takeaway here is this chart has gone up, in a somewhat linear fashion, really since President Biden was elected, because the Iranians knew that Biden had signaled his desperation from a deal more or less from the outset of coming into office. And so the Iranians quickly got to work building this leverage, expanding their nuclear program in all sorts of ways. You can see there is a sort of larger tick up than usual in May here. Basically, Iran could have more than a dozen bombs worth of uranium in several months. And in a matter of 3 to 4 weeks, it could have probably about 10 bombs worth, which is in some ways potentially too quick to be reliably detected by the outside world. Iran has, Nolan, you can go to the next slide, please. As you can see here, the red line on this chart is what the real focus here. That's the 60% enriched stock. You'll notice this has, since late last year, this basically the speed at which Iran has been accumulating this has basically doubled in the last 6 months. That's what drives up those numbers we saw in the first chart. Iran did this in response to a censure resolution at the IAEA board meeting 2 cycles ago, so in November of 2024, in which the IAEA was asked to produce a comprehensive report on Iran's non-compliance with its safeguards obligations. Basically means, in this instance, Iran's refusal to more or less come clean on its past efforts to build an actual nuclear weapon, which would be a violation of the NPT. What's interesting here is Iran has done this by basically burning through all of their 20% enriched uranium, that yellow line, as a way to, basically say, we can escalate, but also we're positioning ourselves ever closer to a large, rapid breakout in advance of the talks that we've been discussing here, and also sends a not so subtle signal to our European partners, the E3. There's plenty of things we can do if you decide to once again censure us at the IAEA board meeting and potentially move ahead with Snapback. We can jump to the next chart really quickly. This is basically a compilation of what the previous chart showed. Again, the number of bombs worth of uranium that Iran has accumulated, sort of quarter by quarter. Again, you'll notice it's ticking up since the last IAEA board meeting and the onset of the current talks. And then we'll jump to the final chart here. So I would just note, now let's look ahead, what might come next in terms of Iran's enrichment program and things related to it. This chart, the various colors of blue and green here show basically the enrichment capacity of all the centrifuges Iran is using at the moment. And you'll see, again, it's ticked up significantly since that last IAEA censure resolution. And this is one of the ways, this is basically more enrichment capacity to produce higher quality uranium at faster and faster speeds. And I would note that dotted red line at the top, that's the difference between that and what's filled in the chart is essentially their spare capacity. And so a couple of takeaways we noticed from the new chart here, things that maybe you can't see in these two-dimensional depictions themselves. Iran has basically now conducting R&D. Whatever Iran does with R&D is usually a sneak preview of its next escalation of the nuclear program itself. It started R&D when it started enriching 20% uranium and then 60%. And now most of its R&D has shifted to producing 60% uranium at mass scale, with numbers that would dwarf what we're seeing now. Almost a real statement of serious intent by Iran to keep expanding its enrichment program. One thing that you cannot see in these charts, we can get rid of the slideshow, Nolan. Thank you. Just very quickly, some of the things we cannot see in these charts. Fordo, Iran's currently its deepest buried site, where they're doing all of this 60% enrichment. They've reconfigured that site in a way now where they can essentially, it's a standalone site. They can go straight from unenriched uranium to weapons grade within that site and do so with fewer centrifuges than they would need anywhere else. I would also note that these R&D activities I spoke of, Iran has announced they're going to move those underground. Currently, it's the only significant enrichment they do above ground, and they've announced they're going to move that into their underground Natanz facility. And just very quickly, some takeaways relating to the diplomacy that's going on. Iran's enrichment program now is so advanced, and in a lot of the ways I tried to quickly breeze through there, that you've now heard various European and other officials commenting on background that Iran's program is so advanced, so dispersed now that even if the program was shut down entirely, they would potentially have the capacity to restart and rebuild it in the space of just a few months. And I would finally note the IAEA also noted that Iran's program, because it's become so advanced at the same time that Iran has rolled back a lot of its inspections, designations for inspectors to come in, removed cameras and other monitoring equipment, things like that, that any deal now to qualify as acceptable in any sense of the term that we'd be using here in this discussion, you would need the IAEA to go back in and basically create an entirely new baseline of a lot of the key components of Iran's enrichment program. That includes stocks of centrifuges. I just discussed here a lot of the things the IAEA can track, but further upstream, how Iran assembles those centrifuges, where and in what numbers, and where it stores them, the IAEA has lost an accounting of that. Same with a lot of their enriched stockpiles once they leave the enrichment facilities for storage or potentially conversion into much more menacing forms than the gas they're currently in. The IAEA has lost a lot of its knowledge, their continuity of knowledge, as they call it, on that. And finally, upstream in the process, the yellow cake that Iran uses to then eventually create the uranium gas that they use for enrichment, the IAEA has also lost track of that. That's all a long way of saying, I know it's easy to focus on enrichment because that's a core issue in the negotiations where both sides are drawing red lines, but a key element of this that we can see as a takeaway from this IAEA report is the need for a strict monitoring regime, including a full accounting of all of Iran's past work on weaponization and its enrichment program as well.
Thanks, Jonathan. So, Steve, let me ask you, we have now this rather scary IAEA report, which by the sanguine standards of an international diplomatic organization is pretty alarmist. What's the IAEA going to do about it, if anything? We have a meeting of the Board of Governors this week happening right now, I believe. Is there anything that the IAEA can or will do as a result of these Iranian advancements and sort of the loss of fidelity or confidence in even our ability to fully know the extent of Iran's nuclear program?
Yeah, so what's been reported is that the Western governments, the U.S., France, Germany, and Britain, have put forward a resolution to again censure Iran for its failure to answer all of the IAEA's questions about the history and nature of the Iranian nuclear program and for their continued escalation of the program. The Iranians, of course, strongly object to that, and we just heard described what they did the last time the IAEA board adopted such a resolution. They're threatening some sort of retaliation should another such resolution be adopted. It appears to me that the Western governments are pretty far along in this process. If they're not going to bring their resolution to a vote, I think they would want Iran to pay some price. So I imagine there's a little bit of diplomacy going on. What are the Iranians prepared to offer to get the Western powers to withdraw or postpone their resolution? But assuming no such last-minute deal is cut, presumably the resolution will pass. It won't pass unanimously, but it's another. I'd like to think it's a step in the direction of ultimately triggering snapback of the UN sanctions, and maybe that's in the back. Hopefully, that's in the back of the minds of the Europeans, but we'll see. I mean, I think the Iranians will see it as an escalation. They may threaten to shut down the negotiations or I think they're doing everything in their power to prevent the adoption of the resolution.
I would.
Is there actual? Sorry, go ahead, Elliot.
I just want to add that we've been talking about enrichment and the question of whether any agreement would permit Iran to go on enriching. But as I mentioned, the Lindsey Graham proposed resolution talks about total dismantlement. And that raises a very important question in any deal, or two questions. What happens to the already enriched uranium? According to the IAEA, about 10 bombs worth of 60% enriched uranium. And what happens to the centrifuges? It obviously isn't enough to say, okay, stop now. You can keep your 10 bombs worth, and you can keep the full infrastructure of centrifuges. Any decent deal is going to have to include the export of highly enriched uranium, and it's going to have to deal in some way with that infrastructure. I would say if it's going to be serious, it's going to be beyond just allowing IAEA inspections, because otherwise then the whole infrastructure is there and you just, in a sense, turn a switch and they can go back to enriching to high levels anytime they're unhappy with somebody. So it will be interesting to see what, if anything, is in the American proposal about those aspects of it beyond just no further enrichment.
To that point, I would note that a lot of what I just spoke about, the advanced centrifuges Iran is using now, but also just the scale of the size of their fleet is in some way a direct result of the JCPOA, which in 2015 didn't require dismantlement in any significant sense of the term, but allowed Iran to mothball a lot of that infrastructure and to continue during the JCPOA doing aggressive research and development to keep improving those machines.
So I guess the question to all of you then is, where do we go from here? President Trump gave an interview, I guess yesterday, when to the New York Post, where he was asked, what the prospects of getting a deal are, and he said, "I don't know. I did think so, and I did think we could get a deal, and I'm getting less and less confident about it. They seem to be delaying, and I think that's a shame, but I'm less confident now than I would have been a couple of months ago. Something happened to them, but I am much less confident of a deal being made." So if that is President Trump's mindset today, what would we recommend to him about how we get to dealing with Iran's nuclear program, rather than continuing down this path of more and more negotiations and more compromise?
I would just note that those words of the president's are quite reminiscent of what he has said in the Ukraine context. We'll all recall, I guess it's about a week ago, that the president said, that Putin's gone crazy, that he thought Putin wanted peace, was open to some kind of reasonable compromise, but now it seems as if he isn't. It's really quite analogous and very troubling for the administration in both areas. They thought they could get a deal, and now we take the president at his word. He is much less sanguine about getting a deal. The bottom line here is, are you going to let it drag on and negotiate right through the fall and through Snapback? Or are you going to make a bad deal? And the critics, including Democrats and some Republicans, will say, that's a crummy deal. That's the JCPOA. You heaped abuse on the first the Obama administration, then Biden, for liking, wanting, agreeing to the terrible JCPOA, and now you've done the same thing. Or third option, use military force, or green light or amber light the use of military force by Israel. And that is a choice that the administration is, of course, delaying and apparently does not wish to make.
So
Go ahead, Steve.
So Blaise, in response to your question, what should the Trump administration do at this stage? I think the issue in these negotiations boils down to whether Iran is going to be prepared to enter a deal that results in the end of uranium enrichment on Iranian territory, and that's a yes or no. Are you prepared to agree to that? Or we can figure out the modalities and the face saving, and we can make sure that you're going to have plenty of nuclear fuel for your civil nuclear reactors. We'll take care of all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, we are going to need a deal where there's no longer enrichment taking place on your territory under your control. And if you're not prepared to agree to that, then ultimately we're just wasting our time talking to you, because we're not prepared to agree to some deal that basically concedes to you the right to enrich on your territory in perpetuity. And so there's nothing to talk about. Now, of course, the Iranians have every reason to stretch out negotiations until October, and I tend to wonder whether that's exactly what they're doing right now. So if I were the Trump administration, knowing that there is the real clock, the October 18th clock, not the June 11 clock, which is an arbitrary clock. I think I would direct Witkoff in the next round to say to the Iranian, put to them that yes or no question. Are we wasting our time here? If your answer is that under no circumstance are you going to agree to a deal that ends uranium enrichment on Iranian territory, okay. No point in diplomats continuing to fly off to meetings and exchange proposals. We understand the bottom line, and we're done. We're done with the diplomacy, and we'll see. Presumably that leads to snapback on the diplomatic side, and then I don't know what it leads to on the military side, but that we clear away the confusion and the mirage that. There's a diplomatic process potentially leading to a diplomatic resolution.
I would just tag on the end of Steve's comment. The issue of deadlines more generally. It's the deadline that ends today or tomorrow has been issued. For better or for worse. There's no shortage of cautionary tales that we can take from past U.S. negotiating failures with the Iranians. And so to Steve's point. If you get to an interim deal that concedes, to Iran's principle that it gets to continue enrichment, which is basically what Iranian officials are hinting they're going to present to the United States, after that you're just haggling over basically how long until Iran can resume full-scale enrichment, essentially unrestricted, the details of how much it would be restricted in the first place. I would say Iran wants to run out the clock, certainly on snapback. They also want to run out the clock on credible U.S. and/or Israeli military options. Buying time served Iran various purposes in the past against the Obama and Biden administrations. It serves an additional purpose now, which is to allow Iran to reconstitute its shattered defenses, which were heavily damaged at the hands of the IDF last year, and also to reconstitute its retaliatory capabilities. And hope to do something better than they did in their two ultimately failed offensives against the Israelis last year. And we've also noticed they're continuing to threaten retaliation against U.S. assets around the Middle East. So that's one more sort of ticking clock in the background. And just finally, I would say, deadlines one way or another are things that the Iranians love to cross. Because every time they cross a deadline, they end up getting more concessions from the United States. That happened 3 separate times in the JCPOA negotiations after we had an interim deal in order to get to the final deal. And with each one of those, we moved farther and farther away from the Obama administration's initial demands or red lines for a deal, which on paper were very strong. We transitioned from those in 3 big steps over to the JCPOA, which essentially reflected all of Supreme Leader Khamenei's red lines.
So I have just a couple more questions for our panelists, and then I'd love to open it up to questions from the audience. So if you do have anything you want to ask, please submit your question using the Q&A function in Zoom, and then I'll read it out. But Steve, let me come back to you and say and ask just on the what can be done question. We've talked about Senator Graham's proposal calling for total dismantlement, but would that have any force of law, or is there anything that Congress can or should be doing to affect the course of negotiations?
Well, I think it's helpful for Congress to express itself on this. You know, we shouldn't forget that in 2015, as the JCPOA was coming together, Congress enacted legislation called the Iran Nuclear Agreements Review Act that requires Congress to review, vote on, and potentially reject any nuclear deal struck between the U.S. government and Iran. That procedure, that law applied to the JCPOA, and the Obama administration complied with it. But that law is still on the books, and it will apply to any deal that the Trump administration cuts as well. So Congress has given itself a seat at the table here. You know, I don't want to represent that they're likely to reject a Trump negotiated deal, but you know, Trump is going to have to be able to justify any deal he presents to the Congress. So I think Congress is doing him a favor by clarifying to him now what parameters they expect any such deal to comply with.
Thanks. And then, Elliot, let me ask you, because you talked about how the administration should support or allow an Israeli strike against Iranian nuclear facilities, but that's not the current reality. And so I was just going to ask you sort of where do the Israelis find themselves now vis-a-vis the Trump administration and Iran, and how do they navigate that going forward?
The latest thing we've seen, of course, is what seems fairly well-sourced statements that the president said to Prime Minister Netanyahu, hold off, I am negotiating. And that's been the administration's position for some months now. The question for the Israelis is going to be, does that ever come to an end? It comes to an end if there's a deal. It comes to an end if the president announces the negotiations are over. Otherwise, as Steve was saying, I mean, it just goes on and on and on, and the Israelis would have to face a much tougher decision of whether, if the United States is saying, hold off, don't do it, would they nevertheless do it and risk a real rift with President Trump? From their point of view, as Steve was saying, the passage of time is very unhelpful because it gives the Iranians the possibility of rebuilding, at least to some degree, their air defenses that were largely destroyed last year. So they're in a very difficult position. There is, I think, a consensus, much more than there ever was before in Israel, that there should be a strike against the Iranian nuclear program. In 2012, when it was contemplated quite seriously, there was no such consensus. There were many people at the top of the security establishment in Israel who didn't want to do it. I think it's fair to say now that throughout that security establishment, and this is partly the result of October 7th, there is agreement that it is foolish and maybe fatal to think you can psych out your enemies rather than simply looking at their physical capabilities and deciding whether you can live with those capabilities. So it's I think it's a very tough position that Israel is in right now.
With that, let me go to questions from our audience. So we have one from Len Hodorkovsky who asks, has the Trump administration detached the nuclear negotiations from all of the regime's other threats, i.e. limiting the regime's missile program, support of proxies, hostage taking, as was the case in the first Trump administration?
Well, as I began by saying we don't really know what U.S. policy is, or at least I don't. And my answer to Len is, well, it looks as if we have. It looks as if the negotiation that Witkoff is participating in is just about nukes. It is not about missiles. It is not about regional issues, meaning Iran's support for terrorist proxies. So although there's been some brave talk, tough talk by Republicans who were in the last 10 years criticizing the JCPOA for exactly those reasons. It didn't include the terrorist proxies. It didn't include the missile program. It looks as if we're heading, from what I can see, it looks as if we're heading in that direction. I hope that's wrong.
So to maybe piggyback on that, we've heard on occasion President Trump talk about making Iran great again. Sort of, I guess, his version of President Obama's, if you unclench your fist, we'll hold our hand. If we can make a deal, we can make Iran great again, make it prosperous, make the Iranian people, give them everything that they're due. How should we understand or interpret those statements? Is that a willingness to embrace the regime if only a nuclear deal gets done?
I'll jump in here. Those statements are based on a real misunderstanding of the Iranian regime. They want sanctions lifted, obviously, and for all the obvious reasons. They don't want an embrace by the United States. They don't want massive American investment. They don't want a U.S. embassy in Tehran. This regime is built on basically three pillars: death to America, death to Israel, and the repression of women. If you take off death to America and replace it not just with, okay, they lifted sanctions, we did a deal, but with a kind of opening to America, you are undermining the regime. That is not what the Ayatollah Khamenei wants. That is not his vision of the future of Iran. He doesn't care about those issues. He doesn't care about giving Iranians the opportunity to live lives of greater luxury. He cares about the economy to the extent that it interferes with regime stability, or might, if it collapsed, create instability. But he doesn't want the kind of relationship with the U.S. that those remarks suggest we believe he wants.
Well, let me turn now, I think, to you, Steve. I think you might want to answer this question. Len's on a roll and has another question here. Since the E3 seems more open to a tougher approach to dealing with the regime than during the first Trump administration, what should we be asking them to do beyond Snapback?
Well, I mean, doing Snapback is pretty significant because, if the UN sanctions come back into force, they're, as I said, legally obligatory on everyone. That means the European Union and all of its members, and plus the UK, will be legally obliged to reinstitute all of their sanctions against Iran, which, let's be clear, the Europeans have not imposed any sanctions on Iran. Today it's perfectly lawful for European companies to do business with Iran. They're still complying with the deal they cut in the JCPOA. So Snapback by itself is pretty significant. It has legal consequences for Iran's economic, or Europe's economic relationship with Iran. There is another point to be made here if we're going to talk about the Europeans, and that is, they were full-fledged players in negotiating the JCPOA. They were at the table. They were signed the agreement. They were part of the entire process. The Trump administration process has completely excluded the Europeans. They're not very happy about that because they were at the table before. Under Trump, they're not at the table at all. So, if we want to start asking them to do other stuff, my guess is they're going to have a request too, which is involve us in your process. And, we want to negotiate this deal too. The JCPOA experience makes me wonder whether that's a deal worth cutting. But I do think that's, my guess is when the European diplomats sit down with the Trump administration diplomats, much of the conversation involves complaints by the Europeans about how they're being cut out.
Well, thank you for that. Maybe for our last round of questions, I can ask all of you what you're going to be watching for in the weeks to come as an indication of where things are going, maybe an elucidation of what that elusive U.S. policy on Iran is. But Jonathan, let me start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most obvious answer is what Iran's counter proposal is, but looking even beyond that, what's directly in front of our noses, I think it would go back and underscore a lot of what we talked about here in the past hour, which is what is the United States prepared to do or not do when Iran inevitably, I think fairly say inevitably, comes back and says to hell with your proposal. We can negotiate about Iranian enrichment on Iranian soil is not for negotiation. The sort of the when and the what underneath that is open for talks. So I think the big watershed moment is what the Trump administration decides to do or not do, both by itself and in concert with our Israeli and European allies, in response to what I think is going to be Iranian rejection of Witkoff's proposal.
Steve?
Well, I've already explained why I think Iran is highly incentivized to drag out these negotiations, at least until October. And Elliot discussed the analogy to the Ukraine negotiations, which, in addition to being analogous, they involve the same U.S. negotiator, in Ambassador Witkoff. If you're the Trump administration, it's pretty frustrating, right? I mean, you ran for office claiming you thought you could achieve great diplomatic success fairly quickly, and I guess there was sort of an interim deal on Gaza, which is now in the rearview mirror and doesn't appear likely to be reconstituted anytime soon. There are the Ukraine negotiations, which I think are being strung out by Putin, and Trump's hope that there's a deal to be cut there seems increasingly divorced from reality, given the policies of President Putin and his approach to those negotiations, and pretty much the same story with Iran. And we've seen in Ukraine that the Trump administration is very hesitant to declare that, no, actually, Putin is not acting in bad faith, and we need to accept that reality and develop a policy that accepts as one of its premises that Russia is not prepared to enter a ceasefire deal. Are they prepared to say the same thing with respect to Iran? I think Iran hopes not, right? I mean, they want to get to October 18th with the negotiations ongoing. So, the Trump administration is a tough place in all of these, because the successes they hope for are not really within reach, and are they prepared to acknowledge that? In the case of Iran, there's a real consequence to not acknowledging it, which is we probably, Iran probably escapes Snapback.
Elliot,
Very
what will you be
briefly,
watching?
because I guess we're out of time. I would just say, in the short run, we should look at what is said by the Iranians and by Witkoff after the next round. Is it the same, well, we're not there, but these were constructive talks? Because that would suggest that it's just going to go on and on. It would be more interesting and significant if the president continued in the new tone he has taken, to be more critical of Iran and suggest that perhaps they don't want a deal.
All right. Well, Elliot, Steve, Jonathan, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. To the audience, thank you for tuning in. To get the latest on the status of Iran talks and JINSA's latest analysis, please check out our Iran talks status page, which you can find from our main page at jinsa.org. Thank you very much, everyone. For those of you who are tuning in this afternoon to hear our conversation with John Hanna and others, including Ambassador Dan Shapiro, about the status of integrated air and missile defense in the Middle East, we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.